SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the course An Introduction to Disability Studies. Today we are going to talk about identity, disability and literature. So before I get into this entire discourse of identity, disability and literature, I have been discussing about representation and disability. In the last lecture, I was talking about that how representation constitutes the very identity of disability. In fact, I also discussed that how various modes of representation have constantly derogated the very idea of disability, and it projected as if they all know what disability is. What was missing in the entire representation, or I would say most of the representation that we have today, is we did not take, this representation, they did not take actual live experiences of people with disability into the account. Now, the question comes, why is it so, right? Like everyone may ask that why do we need to take the live experiences, or let us say we go and meet people with disability and talk about what are they doing, how are they doing, because it is important to know actual condition of people with disability. So, let us say for example, when you are constituting a committee and you are going to discuss a very important issues that concerns everyone, right. So, do not you think that you are supposed to take everyone into the account to talk about the issue that concerns everyone? Because the way we look at certain particular problem may be very different from the other point of view. So, here the key question that I am raising is point of view. What is this idea of a point of view? Let us say for example, you must have read a novel, or let us say we read a drama and we watch a drama, right, we watch a play, and you see the moment you are engrossed into that novel, you forget that who is telling you the story, whose perspective is given in that particular novel. And then we realize that it is the author who is talking about, and we miss that there are other minor characters, their experiences are not articulated in those novels, and due to which what happens, we only get the perspectives of author. Now, the second question comes, do you think that author is a biased, or do you think author has deliberately done so? I won't say that whether he is a prejudiced author or she is a biased, but rather I would say that there is a possibility that until and unless we encounter the experiences of other marginal identity or other minor characters of the novel, it is not possible to understand what they think, what they feel. And that is why Mikhail Bakhtin's comes into the picture, because Mikhail Bakhtin's work talks about that how we should read a novel. Novel is not a monologue, it is a dialogue. The very idea which he propagated before us, the reason was that we are going to see the gaps. Obviously, author's narrative will dominate that, But the problem is when the audience or the reader, when they are not coming in and filling the gaps, and that is where the problem starts. The second is, we have already read Saussure, Derrida and other people. What are their contribution to that? Their contribution to that, if we are reading the text critically, you can subvert the author-centric approach and you can shift it to the reader-centric. In fact, they also talk about that there are many voices, there are many interpretations. It's up to us which one we are going to talk about. Let me give you one more nuanced understanding so that you can understand what we are going to talk about, or why is it important to talk disability, identity and literature. Let us say, for example, you are reading a novel, right? Novel is written by someone who is Indian, right? He is talking about a particular class or caste, or let us say a particular gender, right? And if suppose you are not from that community, what would happen? It would result in that lot of things you won't understand. The reason is that he is writing from his perspective. He has a different understanding of the gender or caste or community, and possibly is that the culture you come from is very different. And because of the difference of your culture, there is a huge possibility that you may misread or you may misinterpret. So, don't you think it is also important to know the culture of the author, to understand, to interpret the text? That is the one proposition. Let us talk about the second propositions now. Suppose there is an author who has written about a novel, right? How do you think that if he has not encountered the experiences of a woman, how far that is going to be real, right? There is again chances that he may or she may misinterpret, and there is a possibility that if you belong to that community, of a community which he is talking about, and if he does not understand the idea of a community or experiences of that community, what would happen? You will relate that this is not about us, this is about someone else, and this problem is prone to happen because the community is different, because the experiences through which he is encountering is different, because the problem through which you are facing he has not faced, and therefore, it is a problematic. Let me give you more clear understanding so that you can easily relate what I am talking about. Let us say, for example, you have never had a fever in your life, like you never encountered what fever is all about. You never thought what fever is, you never experienced what fever is, right? Do you think, are you in the position that will you be able to talk about that how fever affect the body? Think about it. You can hold on a video, stop a video for a second and think about it, and then you can come back and listen the lecture. The answer is you cannot. Again, you may say that, so sir, is it important that only those who have experienced it, they only talk about, or only they are eligible or qualified to talk about those experiences? My humble response to this question is no, and that is where we have a methodology, right? Even if you come into the social science or humanities or any discipline that you go for, and what kind of project you are taking up, it determines, it defines a particular methodology to reach to a particular conclusion or to do a particular research. And that research, obviously, if you come to humanities and social sciences, it says that we must take live experiences into the account, because point of view matters. If you have not experienced discrimination, you will never understand what discrimination is about, and for that you have to meet a person who has experienced discrimination or who has been experiencing discrimination. It is almost impossible to talk about discrimination until you have met a person or unless you have experienced that discrimination, and that is a point of contestation, right? Because as you remember in the last lecture what I was talking about, that most of the representation given to us are very much not factual, is based on the perception of the author, and most of the time he has not even seen and met whom he is representing, but through his popular imagination or whatever he has read somewhere sitting in an AC room, talking about that person or about that discrimination. However, if we read that, we will see, no, it is not about us, and that is why Edward Said's Orientalism is extremely significant text, because that is where he says that we need to question that kind of representation produced by the Occident about the Orient, because of the stereotypical images that produces undergrounded self of colonized people. However, that hardly becomes a true reality. So, therefore, my dear friends and students, for us reality is a very, very far-fetched concept. To reach to that, we have to go through the representation. Through the representation, by questioning the representation, we have to produce a representation. I never say that reality can be reproduced, absolutely not. So, only language is a medium through which we can reach to reality, but language should be more specific, accurate, precise, and that is only possible that if you are talking about a community, if you are talking about the discrimination, you reach to that stage, or you go and meet people who have experienced it. Now, let me make another point, which I was talking about, point of view. Why point of view is important? Because you may not see something which a person has already noticed or seen. Like, let us say, for example, in the previous lecture I was also talking about the problem or discourse of staring, right, gazing. Suppose you have never felt staring, you will never understand that how uncomfortable it is if someone is being stared or someone is being gazed. It is not relatable to you because you have not been gazed ever. And then how would you understand that? Because you are not in that position. So, therefore, one has to go into that position, right. Leading this conversation further, in disability studies, what we are contesting, what we are fighting for, what we are engaging with is the gap between representation about disability and the experiences of people with disability, which hardly meet representation done on people with disability. That is a one major issue that we have been exploring, right, and that is why I have been talking about films, movies, magazines, literature, so on and so forth. Now, the point is, moving ahead this point, if you see the title of my presentation is Identity, Disability and Literature. Now, think for a moment that, as I always say, this is a methodology I am giving you, is a pedagogy, more than a methodology, it is kind of a pedagogy that you must follow this, you must think about it, that whenever you are reading something, look at the title, think for a second before you go to the page and start reading about it. Let us say, for example, when you are reading a book, as I was talking, Staring How We Look, right. This is what book is about, Rosemary Garland Thompson. Why this book is significant and important? Obviously, because it is talking about staring and how it concerns with people with disabilities, and also not only people with disabilities, also about any kind of gazing or staring. Right. It's the significance of this book. Obviously, it has a lot of important points, but I also taught you that when you look at the title Staring How We Look, the title of the book, hold on for a second and think how the title is given. I am sure that in your childhood days, in your school, you must have read reading comprehension. What we do, there is a passage given and there is a question asked, what is the suitable title for the passage? And then you think about, you give a point, you think, you ponder, you consider the points, and then you reach to a title. So, title is something not neutrally decided by X, Y, Z. It is a very systematic thought given to decide to reach to a title. All right. So, that is why I am asking you to every time when you see the title, ask what this title is about. So, let us say Identity, Disability and Literature. Like, what is the identity? right? Identity means that how do you identify yourself? How do you know what your identity is? Let us say for example, when I am saying you are an Indian, what do you mean by that? I am an Indian, right? This is an identity assigned to you, not in terms of only geographically that you belong to particular region which fall under the map of India, and that is why you are Indian. No, it goes further. When you say that I am an Indian, you are talking about that you carry the belief that India has propagated, circulated, talked, discussed, engaged with, which means to say, let us say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam or Sarvadham Sambhav, or let us say diversity in unity, right. So, unity in diversity. So, these are, I am sorry for that. So, these are the things you carry with yourself, right. So, when you are going to abroad, or you are going to a particular country where different people from different countries are coming together, and when you say that you are in India, like most of the time you have seen in the World Cup, what happens, right? I am sure that you must have also noticed in the movies, right, when there are women who are participating in a final game or Commonwealth game or somewhere, let us say for example Dangal, right. In the movie Dangal you see that there is a Indian girl who is going to play, and she wears a sari. Now, the question is why she needs to wear a sari? Why does she need to wear sari? Because to represent India, you need to carry the dress as well. You need to also code of conduct. You also carry the essence of being Indian, right. So, this is what I am saying about it. Is not only geographically you define yourself as a part of that country, but also culturally. What I mean by culturally, that you carry that essence in yourself, right. So, this is what I am talking about, that we need to understand the identity. Identity means being culturally what you are, what you are about. And see, so, when you see suddenly as someone, you say he is a saint. Saint is an identity, like sainthood he has acquired, sainthood, and that is why you say that he or she is a saint. All right. So, when you say someone she is a woman, woman is an identity. So, you do not say a body as a woman, but you look at the dress, you look at the code of conduct, which means the way she is walking, talking, behaving, so on and so forth. So, but suddenly, if suppose she does not follow or adequate to the given idea of being woman, then you will say no, she is not a woman, she is not behaving like a woman. So, this very idea of behaving like a woman, which means to say there is already norms, there is already defined cultural norms which one has to comply to say that someone is from that community or someone is falling from that category, and which is what it called identity. So, identity means how do you identify yourself, right. I identify myself, let us say for example as an Indian, or let us say as a student. I am a student. What I mean by identity being as a student, which means to say that my job is defined. I am supposed to study, write an assignment, behave properly, and do well in the exams, right. But suppose you do not read the entire day, you are roaming around here and there, you are not working at all on your assignments, then people would say that you are not a student anymore. So, it does not mean that you have been thrown out of that college or that institutes. It only suggests that the assignment, which means role, which you need to perform, you are not performing that role. So, the moment you stop performing that role, your identity is snatched, and that is why I have been arguing this, that identity is not static, it is a dynamic, it is a flux, it moves, it evolves, right. What you were a couple of years before is possibly you are not today. Let us say for example, I was a student, I mean still I am a student, but what I mean to say that today I am a teacher, right. So, here you see that moving like one identity, moving from one identity to the another. Let us say it is also that it is not that one person only acquire one identity, he can acquire multiple identities. Let us say for example, a father, teacher, son as well. So, it depends in what context you are talking about a person, accordingly identity is identified. So, now why I elaborated these points, so that you can understand that identity is something that you are not born with. It is assigned, it is given to you, right. So, it is not like you were born as a let us say woman or man, or let us say upper caste or lower caste or whatever, Indian or American, but rather slowly you acquire that identity. And that is why in identity discourse people also argue, thinkers also argue, that you can challenge your identity. There are a lot of time I have met people who say that I don't identify myself as a man, however, like they look like a man. Like, what does this mean? It's also about that how do you identify, like what do you think of doing it, right. So, this is what identity is about, but why are we talking in relation to people with disability? That is important discourse, right. Why are we talking in relation to people with disabilities? We are talking about people with disabilities because the identity assigned to people with disability is very derogatory, because the entire identity given to people with disability only speak about their body, or let us say body marked with difference, only that one speaks. However, there are much more about people with disability, and that is never taken into the picture, and that is where the problem starts with. The problem starts with when you strip out other qualities, other roles that he can perform, but you only reduce that person to just single identity. Let us say, for example, let me make it more clear with examples. Suppose there is a people with a disability, right? What do you think for him? You feel pity, right? You think that he cannot do this, he cannot do that, and you only think in terms of the body that he has acquired naturally, right? So, culturally you think that he is not supposed to access the public spaces, he is not eligible, I am using the word deliberately, eligible for certain roles, and he cannot perform certain roles. Now, the question is, when you say that he cannot perform certain roles, who has given or who decides that he cannot perform those roles? It is not you, it is they or the community or the people who are in that body. They have right to decide that whether they can do or they cannot do. Now, the question or the answer does not stop here only, and if they cannot perform that role, suppose for example, who is responsible? That is another question, because there is a normative standard according to which only a certain set of people can perform that role, and that is decided by certain majority or keeping in mind certain set of people, and that is a problematic. And then our question starts with that, no, we have to get into this and see that whether only this person can perform that role, whether the designation or let us say the very structure of performing that role is restrictive and prescriptive. Why it is not open, why we cannot make it flexible, why we cannot stretch it, where maximum people can be incorporated so that they can also perform those roles. And that is where the question of inclusion or the discourse of inclusion comes. It is because the very idea of normative structure is exclusionary. It deliberately excludes certain people, so that the people who are so called able, they can enjoy their privileges and positions. And this is why we need to question that, and that is why I have been arguing so far that we must take people with disabilities experiences into the account, right. So, that is why this title is Identity, Disability and Literature, right. So, let us go to the slide number 1. So, here you see the first point is talking about there is a tendency to reduce the disabled individual to their disability, overlooking other qualities and complexities. So, this is what I have been talking about, right. I am making a point that most of the time what happened that people with disability, the very identity of people with disability is reduced to their body only. But if you go and meet people with disabilities, they have much more to say, much more to do, much more to talk about. Their experiences are full of richness. They can offer new point of view. They can give you a very new sense of reimagining the world or reimagining the society. But what happens that we as a normal people overlook the other qualities that they possess. We overlook the other complexities that they have. And why do we do so? Because too much time taking and energy consuming. And so it's so easy, let's reduce to this and get out of it. Because it doesn't harm us, it is more privileging the normal people or let's say able people. So there is nothing wrong in reducing a people with disabilities experience only to their body. And even not to the body experiences. It's not like only you can reducing their bodily experiences, but rather you are imposing your understanding on their understanding. So their understanding is not what they are speaking. You are framing their understanding in such a way so that it can align the way you think about them. You got what I am talking about? Right? So it's a very thin line where we misunderstand. Right? Because what happens that most of the time we impose, and if they speak other language, we don't understand. We don't take into the account. We throw this, we reject, we say no, this is not authentic, we say this is not legitimate. Let me give you an example. Suppose for example, if you are speaking something, I mean there are many good movies which have extremely talked about it intensively, and there are many short clips which in due course of lectures I will talk about those clips and those movies where it has shown to you beautifully. Right? Let's say for example, if I come to you and I want to say something, let's say about certain experiences that I have. It may be eating in a restaurant, or let's say riding a bike, or let's say attending a classroom, right. Suppose I want to talk to you. Now, first you are going to expect from me that I should speak in a language that you understand, right. Look at this problem that I have. The problem is you are expecting me that I should speak in a language that you understand. So, if the moment I speak something other language, you are not going to take the pain to understand me, but rather what you are going to do, you are going to ask me to speak or narrate my story in such a way quote unquote, in such a way that you can relate or you can understand. But if I do so, how come it is becoming your experience? So, it's my experience, your experience. It's no more my experience, it's your experience because I have translated my experience in such a way so that it can meet your understanding and your experience. That is a problem, my dear friend and students, and that is, it has been happening, it goes on, still it is working in our academic discourse or as a civic cultural discourse. When are we going to understand that this is something systematically faulty? There is something wrong about it. All right, let's move to the next slide now then. Next point. This uncertainty and discord can make interaction particularly stressful for non-disabled individuals unaccustomed to engaging with disabled individuals. This is what I was talking about. I will elaborate. Despite the potential for discomfort and misunderstanding, physically disabled individuals often possess the skills to navigate these encounters and mend any strained relation, allowing the fabric of social interaction to continue. Despite the challenges posed by disability, these encounters can ultimately be opportunities for mutual understanding and connection when approached with openness and empathy. In order to be recognized as fully human, that is a point, right. Look at this point what I am making, so that you can relate what I have been, you can say blabbering in past 15 to 20 minutes. In order to be recognized as fully human by non-disabled individuals, those with disability often find themselves compelled compelled to navigate relationship from the outside. This means employing various tactics such as charm, intimidation, order, difference, humor or entertainment to elevate the discomfort of non-disabled individuals. So, essentially my dear students and friends, disabled people become supplicants and performers, striving to present valued representation of themselves in their interaction with non-disabled majority. Now, you see how explicitly I have tried to make this point clear to you, that how people with disabilities are constantly under pressure, how people with disability have to perform according to the criteria or the standard given by the normal people or people with able bodies or able bodies. Most of the time, even if they are facing the problems, going through intimidations or let us say experiencing the violence, but they do not speak it out because they want to be part of society. And that is where I have been arguing and questioning that. Why is it so that they are compelled to navigate? Why is it so that other part of society or let us say other group of people are not ready to understand that it is their responsibility as well to navigate? Why is it so that all the laws, all the customary actions are need to be performed by people with disability to to participate in our society or with the able people? Is it because the reason is this compelling, this force, this violence perpetrated on people with disability is because that, as I always say, or borrowing from Shakespeare term, dustbin, right, dirt, because we do not want to even look at them in our society. There is gap in mutual understanding that they are very much part of our society as well, right. So, there is a discomfort for the able body or the normal people when they encounter, when they see disabled people, and then the job is to you keep performing, you keep working the way they have assumed about you. I am repeating it for your understanding. People with disability have to keep performing the way it is expected from the majority or from the normal people about you. You got this clear? I am sure that you understood this point, right. So, this is where our problem start with, and that is where disability studies intervene. It talks about the rights, not the privileges, because normal people are enjoying the privileges and people with disabilities are deprived or even their basic rights. They are deprived of their even basic rights, and that is the problem is all about. That is the concern that we have. Moving to the next slides now. But before I go to the next slide, my dear friends, my pedagogy is, whenever you listen one point, your job is to hold a video for a second, pause the video for a second and think and meditate. Meditate for a second that what I am speaking, what the argument I am making, whether it is making sense to you or not, and most importantly, what you can come up with this idea, right. So, this is a methodology to listen to a lecture, right. The moment like what do you do when you read a book, right, when you read a novel, what do you do? You read something and then you sit on your chair and think. That is exactly what you need to do when you are listening a video, right. Moving to the next slides. So, many newly disabled individuals, they struggle to both carry out and accept such efforts, as it constitutes a subtle and challenging aspect of adjustment. Note down this point, because I am going to come to this point. If these efforts at establishing a rapport prove successful, individuals with disability can mitigate the initial stigma attached to their disability, allowing relationship to develop and deepen over time. Only then can other facets of their personality emerge, shifting the focus away from disability and towards a more holistic understanding of their identity. However, there exists a risk of overemphasizing normalization, potentially leading to the denial of one's limitation and pain for the sake of accommodating others, which people think is called a form of self-betrayal reminiscent of passing. It is important to acknowledge that not all disabilities are alike. Individuals experience their bodies and negotiate their identities in diverse ways. Disability encompasses a wide range of conditions, including congenital and acquired physical differences, mental illness and retardation, chronic and acute illnesses, fatal and progressive diseases, and various bodily characteristics considering disfiguring. So, here you see in these slides I am making two important crucial points. The one point is that most of the time what happens that there are many people with disabilities who face a problem in adjustment, right, because it is not possible always that you can make an adjustment, or even if you are making an adjustment you cannot continue for a long period of time. Like even suppose if I ask you to sit in a chair constantly in one position for more than 1 hour, one possibility there are students who will be okay with it and they can comply with that. Second, there are students who will fail to comply with it, they will not be okay with it, they are not able to comply with the given directions. What do you think about these two kind of students? The one who complies, the second who fails to comply. The one who complies will be considered to be a decent student, good, nice, well educated, trained well. Second, he is somewhat problematic in our classroom. We must teach her or him a lesson by punishing or by rebuking, by scolding or by complaining to the parents, right, by complaining to the parents. So, these are two ways to look at two different students, the one who complies and the second who failed to comply. Now, you also understand that there is nothing wrong with the other student who is going to be punished just not for complying to a given rule, is because you also understand that it is not always one can feel comfortable in sitting one position on one chair for more than 1 hour. But no, that is how norms perform, and that is why, my dear students and friends, I had taught you a lecture first on norms and then I am coming to this, so that you can relate, because if I put the lecture in different order, you won't understand, right. So, that is how normative rule or normative structures allow you to do that, otherwise they are going to punish you in one way or the other way. For people with disability who are not able to adjust, maybe the question of inclusion, they won't be included, or they will be thrown out, or they will not be respected, they will be looked at, oh, I am so sorry, I understand that there is a problem with your body, but you never realize that there is not a problem with your body, there is a problem with the normative rules, there is a problem with the norms, but no, You will say, no, there is a problem with the body, not with the norms, because everyone is ready to comply with it, everyone is doing so, everyone is fine with it. It is because no one told the pain that they go through because of your strict normative cultural perception or attitudes. Because of that normative structure, they have never talked, discussed about that violence that you have been perpetrated since the ages. Because the moment someone does, you throw them outside of the society, put them into the margin. You silence them. You silence them. So now you say, there is nothing wrong with our rules. There is nothing wrong with your rules because no one complains, no one talks about it, because they know that they will be silenced or they will be thrown out. But the moment someone raises the problem, you do not reflect, because you think, no, there is something problematic, there is something disturbances is going on. So that is a problem, my dear friends. That is a problem, my dear students, that now it has time come that we should stop blaming bodies for not complying with the norms. It is a norm that has to be blamed, and they are supposed to be more flexible and not rigid anymore. All right. Look at the second slides. Second slide, the second point that I was making. It is important to acknowledge that not all disabilities are alike. Generally what happens, person suffering from having visual impaired, no one is supposed to say suffering, right, but this is how I am also accustomed, I am also educated from my childhood in the schooling, that all right. So you are not supposed to say this. So if you have a visual impairment, or let us say you have a hearing impairment, or let us say for example visually you have a physical handicapped, you are physically handicapped, quadriplegically handicapped. So what happens? Everyone is tied in one knot. Everyone is treated as equally same. They all are part of one group. They all are disabled. They all have the same experience. They all have the same problem. That's it. So come together, find out one solution and address it. Things will be fine. The point what I am making is extremely significant. Every individual have a different and diverse experience. In the same way, every disability is different and diverse. The experiences are not the same, but most of the time what I see, most of my students and researchers or teachers even, they put them alike. They think that all disabilities are alike. But my dear friends and students, never ever do so. It is a part of understanding and methodology as well, that every disability is unique and different and have a different experience to enrich our narratives. So we are not going to reduce everyone on the same page, right? They all are going to speak something very different, something very unique. So chronic and fatal illness are not the same, they all are different. All right. So this is the point the second slide is making. All right. Moving to the next slide now. Most individuals with disabilities have a nuanced relationship with the label, as their physical impairments are rarely absolute or static. They are dynamic conditions influenced by external factors and often fluctuate over time. Conditions such as multiple sclerosis or arthritis may be progressive or chronic, while others like epilepsy can be acute, right. So what I am basically talking about, that there are some chronic issues and there are some acute issues, and that is why in the second lecture when I was talking about terms associated with disability studies, I very clearly talked about that how disability, disease, deformity, freak, handicap, impairment, they all are very different. That is why I talked about the term associated with disability studies in this lecture number 2, because when I come to this slide you can easily understand and we do not need to pay much attention or much time on this, right. So this is what I am talking about, that acute pain and chronic pain, they are not the same. There are certain external factors which are also responsible for certain pains, but there are also certain bodies where body has something to say more about their pain than anything else. So, we are not going to mix it up. All right, let us go to the point again. Conditions such as multiple sclerosis or arthritis may be progressive or chronic, while others like epilepsy can be acute. Even seemingly static disabilities like amputation, right, because as you know, amputation can never be static. It has a different experiences, but you are not going to come out of that amputation, right. It is not like if you lost a limb, you are going to get a new limb. Obviously, I am going to talk more on like prosthetic and all that, but what I mean by that the kind of a limb that you had, you are not going to have the same limb again, and that is what is talking about static amputation, right. So, now imagine a person who lost his leg in a car accident and a person who was born without a leg. Do you think their experiences are going to be the same? No. The simple answer is no. They both are very, very different. All right. So, this is why I am giving you an example, so that you can easily relate and understand the point I am making. All right. Let's move to the next point. The gradual process of aging renders everyone susceptible to the experience of disability, eventually a reality that many who perceive themselves as able-bodied may be hesitant to acknowledge. As physical abilities evolve, so do individual needs and the perception of those needs. Additionally, the presence of a pain, often accompanying or precipitating disability, can significantly influence both the extent and perception of impairment. So, one more point is made, let us say for example, when you are aging, like obviously that is part of gerontology as well, but disability studies covers that point in fact. So, let us say for example, when you are getting old, obviously you are not going to feel the same the way you used to experience a decade before, but most of the time what happens, we do not want to acknowledge that we are getting weaker, right, quote unquote. So, are you going to say that the experiences of the person who is getting old and the person who is disabled are the same? No, but they both fall in the same category. Disability is not just about the body, it is about questioning the norms, restrictive norms where it is asking you to comply with it. All right. Let us go to the Ellen Scarry, see what Ellen Scarry has to say about the pain. In fact, I would suggest you that please read Ellen Scarry's book. Okay. So, look at the slide please. Ellen Scarry notes that because pain is invisible, unverifiable and difficult to represent, it is frequently subject to misattribution or denial by those who do not directly experience it. Disability encompasses a wide array of experiences and emotions. It can be painful, comforting, familiar, alienating, bonding, isolating, disturbing, enduring, challenging, infuriating or ordinary. So, within the complexity of human relationship, disability transcends the limited scope of what the disabled figure signifies. The potential for anyone to become disabled at any times renders disability a more fluid and potentially threatening concept to those who identify as normative compared to other seemingly more stable marginal identities such as gender or ethnicity. The circumstances and timing of acquiring a disability influences perception as well as the individual's process of incorporating or assisting it with their sense of self. So, for example, a gradual disablement due to aging or progressive illness may not be perceived as disability at all. So, sudden and severe impairment resulting from an accident is often experienced as a more profound loss. So, the visibility of a disability also impacts social interaction akin to the dilemma faced by individuals with invisible disability or non-visible identities like homosexuality, who must navigate the decision of whether or when to disclose their condition. So, furthermore, the distinction between the normal and the functional aspects of disability shapes its perception. Individual, those disability are primarily functional but not visible may face accusation of malingering or fail to meet expectations about their physical capabilities. So, now here you see I am talking about two forms of disability, the one which is invisible and the second one is which is visible, right. Let me put it this way and make it more clear. Let us say for example, when you see a person who is homosexual in a particular society which is more normative, for them there he feels as if he do not belong to the society. Homosexuality in a normative society where heterosexuality is prevalent is a disability, all right, because disability is not about, as I always say, that it is not only about that if you do not have a limbs, it is also about or more about how do you feel, how do you experience yourself in that society, right. Or let us say for example, there are many cognitive impairments in students and friends or children. You see very often that they are not very much visible in the society, because their disability is not visible, but they are also disabled in some sense. But the problem is that society finds very uncomfortable in making them to conform with the rules. So, what they do, they are never ever come into the society and people not ready to make any adjustment or changes in the society given. Moving to the next slide, those with primarily formal disabilities may consider incapable despite being fully competent. Additionally, conditions such as facial disfigurement, scarring, birthmarks, obesity and corrected visual or hearing impairments often carry social disabling effects. Even though they may not entail significant physical dysfunction, the history of freak show demonstrates the lack of clear distinction between primarily formal disabilities and racial physical feature considered atypical by dominant white standards. So, while categories like ethnicity, race and gender are rooted in shared traits that foster community formation, people with disability often do not perceive themselves as a cohesive group. So, there is a little somatic commonality among people with different disabilities due to the diverse range of needs and situations they face. For instance, let me give an example so that you can understand beautifully. A blind person, an epileptic, a paraplegic, a deaf person and an amputee do not necessarily share a common cultural heritage, traditional activities or physical experiences. So, for example, there is a blind person, there is an epileptic person, there is a paraplegic person, there is a deaf person, there is an amputee. So, here you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they all can be called disabled, but everyone's experience is not going to be the same, right. This is the point. So, the primary shared experiences among people with disabilities is the stigma they face, right. So, the point is this, that they all are very different, they all are very diverse, the experiences are very, very different, but what is common or what is maybe equally applicable is that they all are facing exclusion and stigma. They all are not the same, they all are very different, they all are living life differently, but one thing is common, or let us say shared experience about them is they all are facing exclusion and stigma, and that is why that is one thing you can say bring them together, make them common. All right. Moving to the next slides. Despite facing similar societal attitudes and barrier, disabled people often avoid stereotype one another in an attempt to normalize their own social identities. So, many individuals with disability may have considered themselves non-disabled prior to joining the disabled community and may have had met limited contact with other disabled individuals. It's like other culturally imposed categories derived from biological difference. The identity of disability can feel forced and tends to overlook intra-group variation. So, I am sure that you all have seen special education in your surroundings, right. So, special education was meant only for people with disability. However, I am very much against it, because until and unless people with disabilities are meeting with so called able bodies, experiences, changes in the society is not going to be much. But obviously, where it was extremely problematic to include them, at least they are getting the right of education. That is also remarkable, but we need to keep pushing forward the boundaries which is still alienating them, excluding them outside. All right. So, most disabled, like special education, further exemplifies this tendency towards ghettoization, right. That is what I am critiquing at, by segregating individuals with disabilities from non-disabled students without considering individual needs. So, most disabled individuals are surrounded by non-disabled families and communities where disabilities are perceived as calamitous, right. This is how it is perceived. Further isolation with their social circle, right. So, the point what I am making is that their experiences are very different, but until and unless you bring them together, they will never be part of inclusion. Inclusivity will not be promoted. So, look at this slide again. This isolation mirrors the experiences of gay and lesbian who may feel fundamentally isolated from one another within their social context. So, representation often simplifies these complexities in favor of the rhetorical or symbolical potential of the prototypical disabled figure, who serve as a lightning rod for the emotion of the reader or other significant character. So, by shifting the interpretive framework from aesthetic and metaphor to the critical perspective of culture studies, it becomes possible to deneutralize these representation. So, by examining disabled figure rather than focusing on grotesque, crippled, deformed, we must go beyond aesthetic consideration and enter into the political arena. So, by highlighting the gap between representation of disabled figure and lived experiences of individual with disabled bodies, it becomes evident that representation plays a significant role in shaping the identity and fate of real people with disability. All right. So, this is where we comes to the consensus or to the conclusion that it is high time that we are going to question the representation. It is high time that we are going to understand that experiences are very different, and I am invoking that people with disabilities must not be projected just for aesthetic or only for metaphor, but rather we must go beyond that and get into the political arena where we must talk about the inclusion, rather than giving something which does not meet what people with disability are demanding for. All right. So, with this I would end my lecture here, and I would request you to take a pause, think for a second to what the argument I am making and how you can enrich disability studies, and what are your perspectives about the experiences, the ideas, the arguments that I am making. So, in the next lecture I am going to talk, which is extremely interesting, is about disability and technology. Till then, I will take your farewell for now. See you in the next time. Thank you so much. Bye bye.